Thanks for listening to the Women Emerging podcast. Every week we put up a new episode with insights into leadership, practical leadership, seen through the eyes of women leaders of all ages and all sectors from right across the world. Our aim is for women to be able to say, if that's leadership, I'm in. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and join Women Emerging on our website, womenemerging.org. That's womenemerging.org for more fabulous free leadership content. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Julie Middleton here, expedition leader and podcast host. This is the, I can't remember. I think the 5th in the series on essence. The essence of ourselves that we then translate into how we lead. We've had a whole series of women from the expedition talking about bits in their essence and how they translate them into their leadership. Last week, Hinamoa spoke about her ancestors, past, how they influence her present, and how that makes her think about the future. And as you'll see, I think doing Hinamoa last week on ancestors was almost the perfect precursor to today with Ayesha on the subject of trauma and how trauma impacts our leadership. It was a very, very good conversation. I hand over it to immediately. Ayesha, last week we looked at another piece of essence, which was ancestors. Mm-hmm. And Hinamoa talked a lot about how important it is to understand your ancestors, and actually also to understand that you are ancestors to future generations. And how, when you think in that way, it has an impact on how you lead. And in a way, it was a sort of perfect pre-episode to this episode, isn't it? Because when you think about trauma, I think sometimes you sort of think about trauma in the moment or in the period, and you don't necessarily think of it as something that you receive and hand on. Mm-hmm. And that must have an impact. I mean, trauma must have an impact on leadership, because leadership is so much about relationships, isn't it? And about understanding yourself before you even start with the relationships. Anyhow, you're better than me on this one, Ayesha. Talk to me.
So trauma is very interesting. I think that we've gone from a place of being thinking about it very myopically, from the space of war veterans and just talking about PTSD, to now realizing that there are actually multiple forms of trauma, and it's not just a cross-section in time, but there is the idea that was actually started by a psychiatrist in 1966, but sort of nobody took it on until now, where we're talking about intergenerational trauma, historic trauma, collective trauma, and how the intergenerational trauma is actually, there's so much neuroscientific evidence that it actually travels through our genes and through our epigenetics and through our attachment styles through generations. So, if my great grandmother kind of went through, let's say, the trauma of partition, then the trauma that she felt gets passed on to her children, not just through genetics and epigenetics, but how she's nurturing, how she kind of connects with these children and has sort of a more distant attachment style with them, so that it keeps getting on. And then beyond that, the stories that you hear, the narratives that you keep hearing at dinner table, in dinner table conversations, or the movies that are put together. So, all of that actually travels through sort of different generations, to the point that it might show up in my dealings and relationships, and how I manifest sort of my leadership styles, or how I am relating to the different people in my life. So what has really shifted in this space is a lot of neurobiological and neuroanatomical research that they've been doing on animals and mice, that have clearly shown that it's traveled through at least 4 to 5 generations, unless you do something in time to shift it and change it.
I suppose lots of people, and maybe you'd count me in this, is they sort of think, trauma, trauma, and trauma, but that's personal stuff. It's not about my leadership.
Right. So when I think about how trauma affects me, and I think about sort of either the collective trauma that I am feeling. So for example, we've just gone through the collective trauma of the pandemic, right? And it's affected all of us. Or the collective trauma that comes from, the sexual underpinnings or the racial underpinnings, like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement. Then there's absolutely no way that it won't show up in my dealings as a leader, in how I'm manifesting my leadership style, and how I'm talking to my employees, and how I'm taking decisions or not taking them, or stalling on some, or jumping right ahead to some, and how I'm sort of collecting my team. So there's actually literature around.
Give me an example. Give me an example. Don't give me the literature. Give me an example.
So an example of a leadership style. So if I have a distant leadership style, or let's say because I manifest trauma in a way where I am risk averse, right? Where I'm cautious, I'm distant, I am unable to read in terms of my EQ, I'm unable to read what my team is feeling at that point, then I'm unable to kind of show up with a lot of confidence in, what kind of risks are we taking. I'm unable to be confident in terms of how I am providing my vision to my team. I'm not connecting with them. I'm not understanding their concerns. And so I am actually not creating a lot of confidence in them. And then, of course, they're not giving the best to that vision or to that idea. It can
hang on. Give me another example that's wonderful.
So another example would be, so trauma really affects your own sense of self, right? It causes me to second guess myself at all times. So let's say, I have data or evidence that's provided to me that this is something that needs to shift. So I can take my example in the shift in the space of mental health, or how we manifest mental health disorders, or what kind of an initiative we need to take. But because my sense of self is affected, I am reticent about sort of taking that step and feeling secure in my own self, that I have the knowledge, I have the gravitas, I have the wisdom, I have the experience, I have now the evidence. Let's take this leap of faith and move forward and, try to work on this initiative. Because
that's interesting, because when I said beautiful and I expressed myself badly, I was thinking, is there ever an example of when trauma actually makes you a much better leader? So for example, I've had the trauma, let's say, of being excluded. Mm-hmm. And that has made me an infinite. I'm not talking about myself. I'm too lucky. But I've had I know the trauma of being excluded, and therefore I am a much, much better leader because I have no intention of handing that on.
So, Julia, trauma is pretty much an essence of life, right? I see trauma as being very much a part and parcel of who we are and what we bring to the table. None of us have been able to. I don't think any single person who can say that I've not had any trauma in my life, right? They may not be big, huge traumas, but just in case, let's say you are a person of who's been born in a privileged position, in a privileged race, whatever it might be. But if you are someone with even half the EQ that is needed, you would actually feel the collective trauma of what's happening around you, right? So the way trauma actually shifts you into becoming kinder, more compassionate, more empathic towards people, makes you sort of a better leader, because now you're able to pick up from. But for that, I think it's important, like in anything else, is for you to understand the participation of trauma, the presence of trauma in your life, where it comes from, and then the self-reflection around it, that how does it manifest in me? How do I manifest my trauma? And then once you have that, then you can shift to make the changes that are necessary to work through your trauma or to process your trauma.
And when we talk about trauma, you sort of immediately go to war, violence, abuse, probably poverty, those kinds of words.
Right.
Do you also go to being a minority, being the recipient of prejudice, and how does that show up as trauma, and therefore how does it show up in leadership?
So trauma could be from anything, right? So as I said before, that when we think about trauma, we think of sort of big things. We think about race, we think about sexual abuse. But for example, the most common kind of abuse in children and adolescents is actually neglect. It's actually not sexual abuse, it's not physical abuse. And there are lots and lots of studies that talk about how neglect actually causes significant emotional and psychological trauma in children, which results to how they kind of grow up, and it actually has significant adverse effects on their development, multiple forms of development. So that could be something that could easily be seen. What kind of and again, people, when I was talking about intergenerational trauma, I think that becomes very much part and parcel of the intergeneration trauma, that if you have a avoidant attachment style because of your own trauma, then that's how you're raising your children, and then that is causing the neglect or the psychological or the emotional abuse on their children by virtue of not doing what you should be doing. So that's one kind. Poverty, of course, could be another one. You've talked about minorities. So again, what does it mean to constantly be or live in a space of fear? So as minorities, there's again, evidence, but stories, how people that are a minority status live with caution, live with sort of this fear that they don't want to attract attention to themselves. So that in itself is a trauma where you're unable to kind of say that I belong, right? And I belong freely. But then, there's adversity and there's caution around that. So trauma kind of shows up in all sorts of shapes and form. There could be secondary trauma where, again, somebody living in Pakistan, for example, may not actually see firsthand the trauma of race, for example, or of the movement of Black Lives Matter. But if you are, if you read, if you watch the news, if you watch movies, if you have exposure to social media and the rest of the world, then that's trauma that you are actually imbibing from your surroundings.
That's very interesting. Come back to the race issue.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, go ahead. Did you?
No,
have
you go on. You go on. Because I was going to add, on the race issue, there is the sense of fear. There's also that deep sense of injustice, and that in itself is trauma, no doubt, too.
Right, right. So race is an interesting one because, again, you might not, in your own sort of cultural context, you may kind of notice the trauma around the socioeconomic status more. You may notice the trauma of being a certain color, for example, more. You may notice the trauma of patriarchy, of colonialism. But if you are exposed to, or if you are, again, I'm going to use the same term, sort of even remotely empathic to what's happening around you, which most humans are. They kind of feel the pain of others. And especially when it comes in the forms of storytelling, when it comes in the form of that individual person's story or a group story around injustice, then you start feeling that secondary trauma. I had earlier spoken about how intergenerational trauma is passed on by narratives in the family, by stories that are told from one generation to another. So similarly, if you're constantly hearing the stories of what is happening around you in your world, then you feel that source of injustice. And injustice is a universal phenomenon. So while you might not actually feel that firsthand injustice of race, you felt it in other ways. So you're able to feel the pain of others, and that also shifts your neurobiological processes and neuroanatomical processes in your brain, just like as if you were there and actually feeling it firsthand or actually experiencing it firsthand.
And if you are experiencing it firsthand, what impact will that have on your leadership?
Let's start from the impact of trauma generally, and then I'll talk about it, how it gets reflected in leadership. So more, and I might be forgetting some of the ways that it manifests, but trauma is going to affect, as I said, your sense of self. Trauma affects your emotional regulation. Trauma affects your cognition, your thinking and your thinking processes. Trauma affects your behaviors. Trauma affects your body. So there's a really brilliant book by Dr. Cole called The Body Keeps a Score. So trauma affects your bodily functions. So when any of these are affected, then automatically all of these, and trauma affects your relationships. So all of these are very much part and parcel of how you lead. So if trauma has affected your behavioral manifestations, then of course that's part of leadership. It affects your cognition, that's part of leadership. So you're not able to make sharp decisions, in time decisions, confident decisions. Trauma affects your relationships. Leadership is all about relationships, and how do you elicit confidence in your team if you're not feeling confident yourself. If it affects your body, as we said, the body keeps a score, then things like irritable bowel syndrome, things like eczema, things like stress that shows up in all sorts of different ways and form in your body, fibromyalgias, chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety. So that obviously automatically affects your leadership style if your body is affected from the trauma that it's manifesting somatically.
So let's get personal.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever, can you think of it's a stupid question, can you think of a moment where you have been the recipient of racism, or I suppose Islamophobia? Let's put misogyny aside for a moment. Let's talk about race and faith. Can you think of a moment where you was the recipient of it? What kind of trauma it might have played out as, and how it might have influenced your leadership?
Uh, so I, okay. So I'll talk a little bit about Islamophobia, and not necessarily in a way that perhaps it affected me personally, but I saw it on the rise around me as I was moving up in the space of leadership. I saw it secondhand, sometimes firsthand, but mostly kind of, hearing stories of my patients that were coming in, hearing stories from my colleagues who were working in the space of health, hearing stories from international talks that were being done on Islamophobia and how it was affecting the mental health kind of space. And it's traumatic. Sort of hearing those stories is traumatic from the perspective of, one, you're feeling the trauma, or you're hearing firsthand the trauma of people that look like you, that have been raised by you, that kind of share the same faith as you have. But then it also becomes personal, because you start thinking, well, if it can happen to them or their children or their spouses or their families, then it could happen to you. Right. So you automatically, again, and I'm bringing a little bit of neuroscience into it because I think it's important, but it shifts, how your amygdala functions, which is where trauma sits in the brain. And it sends a lot of hormonal responses and the vagal nerve that connects your brain to the rest of your body. And your amygdala almost becomes, how we talk about the fight and fright. So little things that kind of make you question where they wouldn't have make you question before. So your amygdala almost becomes an oversensitive smoke alarm. So, even a tiny statement somewhere, a tiny, kind of reference somewhere automatically kind of, ignites that space in your brain, and you stiffen up and you start thinking, is this happening because I'm a Muslim? Is this happening because, I belong to the same faith? Or is it happening, are they saying it against, it's like, is religion involved somewhere, or race involved somewhere? So what it would do to me, for example, or how it's manifested in me, is that one of the two of the ways that people deal with trauma, or the presence of trauma in their lives, is through denial or through minimization, right? And I feel, or I felt, and I'm, actively trying to work around that, is that I've dealt with it in both those ways. So, kind of understating in the way I talk, in the things that I say, in how I manifest my Muslimness on religiousness, right? So I've sort of taken a backseat on that, trying to keep it on the back burner. Also not talking about it in terms of, the vulnerability that I would show otherwise in other spaces. I think that, it's so important for leaders to model vulnerability. And you can only do that when you've dealt with your trauma. And within that space, I feel that I minimize the presence of that trauma in my life. I don't talk about it. I don't, because it feels unsafe. There is a lack of psychological safety in me, bringing that aspect into my leadership style. So I'll give you a very concrete example on that one. That it's been about 6 to 8 months where a colleague of mine and I, the two of us, have been talking about incorporating the idea of cognitive behavior therapy and religion, right? And how people who've grown up in a specific culture in the culture of a specific religion, like for example Islam or Muslims, how does that manifest in doing CBT or cognitive behavior therapy in patients who are Muslims, right? How do the ideas of the religion affect their thought processes, and how does the therapist then talk about them and bring them to light and try to work with those? And we've just still not kind of gone ahead and said that, all right, we're ready to work in the space, because it feels more vulnerable, even though in any other space, as a leader, I would have jumped at a new idea right away. So that could be an example of how it affects your leadership style.
Somewhere during this conversation, you use the word colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And when you used it, I was thinking, there's the old-fashioned colonialism, well, the centuries-old colonialism, and then there's a modern-day colonialism, I would think, too. But
mm-hmm.
Is that part of trauma for a large part of the world?
Yeah. So it's an interesting trauma, right? Because colonialism is all about someone with or proclaiming, somebody proclaiming greater power, coming in and telling you that you're not good enough, so we need to come in and shape you and your systems, right? And shape you as a society. And slowly their views become part and parcel of how your systems function or had been functioning before that. So the colonialism has been very interesting, because it's actually worked by through a lot of psychological what's the word that I want to use, it's like putting you on the back burner. So eventually you started believing that you're not good enough, and whatever's coming out from that particular civilization is better in some shape or form. So there's significant amount of psychological trauma that gets passed on, because again, your sense of self becomes affected, your cognition becomes affected, you're unlikely to take sort of decisions the way you would otherwise, or you're unlikely to adapt to different sort of environments, or kind of ability to trust your own instincts and trust your own sense of self. So that I feel, and it continues. So again, that's intergenerational. So even today, when colonialism, or actually, sort of we've gained independence, and it's been, over 80 years since there has been actually a physical independence, there still exists the idea that anything that is coming from the West, for example, it will be superior to whatever we are actually building indigenously. Anything that came from outside was considered to be superior. And so education that comes from the outside, a degree that comes from the outside, the use of English language, the more it's used, the better you can speak. That means that you must be more intelligent and more accomplished. So it continues. And then there's a significant amount of colonialism in higher education, significant. Just today, I was talking to someone in the morning about how I was reflecting on it last night, that, the idea of misogyny and anti-feminism, or women harassment, or, all of these things are such Western influences in our country. So this whole region, the whole South Asian region, has a long history of matriarchy and very, very strong, very well respected female leaders. And there was no question about, even in institutions, and also motherhood was considered to be such a noble thing that, we need to take care of her. She is the mother of the future generations or my child, or she is the, but the Western influence completely shifted that. So the idea of motherhood suddenly became more of a, like,
Burden.
yeah,
Burden.
and you've got to create them, you've got to create babies, and so what, it's like you've no big deal. And this is a whole historic idea of, or cultural idea, that you need to keep the mother safe and happy and content, and because she's carrying the future generation. And that has completely shifted sort of with the Western influence. So it's I think that there have been a lot of repercussions or continuous effect, generational effects of colonialism in the space of leadership as well.
So pulling all these strands together, I think you're saying that, yes, trauma is one of the parts of essence being the things that are the essence of your leadership, and particularly women's leadership, whether that trauma is primary or secondary, and recognizing that. And therefore, what's the right word? Is it managing that? Being aware of that? Counterbalancing that? What is it? What is it that we need to do as a result of having of putting trauma in the essence circle and naming it and seeing it as part of you? What do you do as a result of that?
So what you do as a result of that, Julia, is one, I think it's leaders have to make the idea of healing trauma safe. Okay. And they can only do that by, again, modeling it themselves. So one is that, the idea that, the discussion around trauma scares people away, but the idea that it can be healed, it can be processed. And this is how I do it, having open conversations around it. And when I say this is how I do it, I don't mean going to the therapist or healing trauma comes from music, comes from cycling, comes from being close to nature, comes from kind of narrating your own stories and using humor to kind of say. So there can be multiple ways that you sort of process your own trauma, but having those conversations, you make that okay. Then I think one way that leaders can, understanding that trauma is such a big part, is and I'd like to think that I do that myself quite a bit, and I feel it's exceedingly important, is to model vulnerability. I feel that this idea is of that I don't have any spaces where I'm vulnerable is very toxic, because it doesn't leave anyone any space to be authentic. So I feel that piece is important, whether if the leader has been able to reflect on their own trauma and reflect on how it manifests in their leadership style, in their personal lives, only then they'd be able to model that vulnerability and kind of say, this is my space where I'm feeling burnt out, or I'm feeling like I need a pause. I need to look for silences right now, or, now I'm ready to go full throttle, whatever it might be. So I feel that modeling vulnerability is important. Then, developing what I've talked about a little bit before in another podcast, is about developing compassion. And you can only do that if you've again reflected on your own trauma and reflected on your sense of, like, if you are actively going through trauma yourself, then it's hard for you to have enough energy or enough compassion about others. So again, knowing yours, processing yours, and then developing that compassionate empathy, and all of that, I think at the end leads to what I call conscious leadership, that you're doing leadership you're understanding that leadership is an action, it's changing, it's shifting, and you're conscious about it. And, you're actually making moment to moment sort of decisions and change around how you are manifesting your leadership.
This conversation has been wonderful. I'd love to add to this friendships. And I'll give you an example. My childhood had too much experience of women who drank too much.
Right.
Okay. And alcohol. And it's interesting now, if I'm in an interesting situation and there's a very drunk woman, my children tend to circle around me because they know that mum's judgment will be wrong. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's also to have, in my case, children there, but to have friends around you who can sort of circle around you when they know that trauma is going to manifest and mess about your own judgment.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, for me, it's very vulnerable women. No, we're not vulnerable. Very, I take that back. I think the word is, anxious, dependent women, women who are so deprived of their own sense of self that they'll manifest as, with a lot of helplessness. And I know that judgment comes in. My immediate response is, please pull up your socks, just get up and just get going. Like, there is no space for this. There's no, we can't, we can't have helpless women. You've got to just get up and pull yourself up together and somehow. And my friends, male friends, female friends, know that, and they'll pick it up and they're like, not okay, right? Think about, that person's trauma, and if they don't have those reserves, and they don't have those reserves right now, and we need to work with them from this place of compassion and empathy.
Ayesha, thank you so much. Not for a minute am I going to make any attempt to pull any of what you said together. Anything that you've said over the last 35 minutes, almost impossible to summarize. I am still, if the truth be told, still processing it in my head. So thank you. Next week is, I think, the last of our series on essence, and that is Aysata, and she's going to talk to us about education. Very, very much looking forward to it. In the meantime, lots of love, Julia.
To become part of our movement and share your thinking with us, subscribe to the podcast and join the Women Emerging group on our website at womenemerging.org. We love all of the messages you send us. Keep them coming.